we've titled this Deter, Detect, Defend, Enhancing Internal Controls Against Fraud. And what we're going to do is talk a bit first about internal controls, and then we'll talk a bit about when internal controls go wrong and you end up with fraud, waste, or abuse, and kind of how to handle that. So let's start with some introductions, though. Again, I'm Sarah Dreyer, and I am the Acting Inspector General for the EAC. I've been in this role since April, and with the office since February of 2022. My colleague, who you'll hear from in just a moment, is Joshua Shoemaker. He is a senior auditor with our office, and he has been here for just over 2 years now himself. So this is usually where I pause to see who I have in the room, but it was great to see you all putting that in the chat earlier. So I think I've got a good idea of who we have here, and I can proceed on telling you a bit more about our office. So we are the Office of Inspector General, and offices of Inspector General exist throughout the federal government, and we're tasked with combating fraud, waste, and abuse. So that's both on the prevent side as well as the detect side. And one of the reasons I really like giving these presentations is because it gets to focus on the preventing of fraud, waste, and abuse, and not just the catching of the wrongdoing part. But across the federal government, there are currently 73 offices of Inspector General, and in total, there's about 14,000 OIG employees. So each agency, each federal agency has their own for the most part, and some of them are quite large, right? So if you look at like a Department of Defense or a Department of Labor, their offices of Inspector General are hundreds, or in some cases even over 1,000 people. Ours is much smaller. We've got, I think it's four at this point, four people and a contractor. One of the key aspects that I would highlight of offices of Inspector General is that we are independent from the agencies that we oversee, which is what helps ensure the objectivity of our work. So the EAC, Office of Inspector General, gets its power from two places. The IG Act and HAVA, or the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And our specific mission is to safeguard the federal investment in our electoral system by conducting objective and meaningful oversight. So, said another way, our goal is to help EAC perform as effectively as possible. We do that a couple ways. We do that through audits, reviews, investigations, and then outreach like this. As I mentioned, we have 4 full-time employees, and our offices are co-located with EAC in Washington, D.C. So people always like to ask, how do you choose what you look at, right? How do you plan your work? So at the highest level, we have a strategic plan that guides our work. Then each year, we put together an annual oversight plan, which is public and available on our website. We just put it out there on October 1st, so you're more than welcome to go pull it down and see what we're planning to do over the next year. Maybe Josh could put a link in the chat. But our work is planned based on a couple of things, and it changes each year based on the risks that we see and the resources available to us. But there are things we do every year. For example, an audit of EAC's financial systems or an audit of their information security program. But then there are also discretionary projects. So with our remaining resources, right? Money and people. We consider a couple things. That includes our strategic goals, the amount of funding going to particular programs or grant recipients in some cases, the length of time since the subject matter was last audited, the results of prior work, If a previous audit had no findings, it's less likely to get picked than if a previous audit had 20 findings. Um, we also look at what topics could have the most impact, and that includes what our stakeholders are most interested in and what they request. We do outreach with EAC officials, with Congress, and other interested parties out there in the industry. So those last two bullet points there are why we're here today, right? To talk about fraud and get awareness out there. And then we'll tell you at the end about our hotline. So if you do suspect fraud or waste or abuse, that you know how to get in contact and tell us about that. So again, what we want to talk about today is internal controls, what they are and why they're important, and then what to do when they fail and there may be fraud, waste, or abuse. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Josh to get us started on internal controls. If I forgot to say it at the beginning, you are more than welcome to speak up and ask questions at any point. You can either put them in the chat or just turn on your mic and ask away. So Josh, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And to reiterate that, I encourage anyone, if you have a comment or something to add, please interrupt me. I'm not going to get offended. I encourage it. So let's dive into the wonderful world of internal controls. Let's start with a question. When you hear the term internal control, what comes to mind? Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute and share if you're willing to. Maybe at that time of the day where it's difficult. I know this is not the most exciting topic, but compliance, that's a good one. Processes and monitoring, all good answers. So what are internal controls? The Government Accountability Office in the Green Book defines internal control as a process effected by an entity's oversight body, management, and other personnel that provides reasonable assurance that the objectives of an entity will be achieved. It's important to keep in mind that the purpose of the internal control is to achieve the objective, not to have the internal control. The GAO goes on to define an internal control system as a continuous built-in component of operations that provides reasonable assurance that an entity's objectives will be achieved. Internal controls are your first defense in safeguarding assets. No matter how well designed, implemented, or operated, an internal control system cannot provide absolute assurance that all of an organization's objectives will be met. The best you can do is design it in such a way that you can achieve reasonable assurance. Factors outside of your control, like the recent storms we saw move through, can influence management's ability to achieve all of its objectives. Therefore, once in place, effective internal control provides reasonable, not absolute assurance that objectives will be achieved. The most widely recognized source of guidance comes from COSO and the GAO's Green Book. I highly recommend the GAO's Green Book. It's very approachable, and I will put a link to that in the chat. The image at the bottom of the slide is from the GAO's Green Book and shows an overview of the process from identifying the objective to achieving the objective. All right. Next slide, Sarah. So why are internal controls important? An effective system of internal control can help grantees stay in compliance with federal grant requirements and increase the likelihood that grant funds are used for the intended beneficiaries. But more importantly, 2 CFR 200.303 specifies a grantee must establish, document, and maintain effective internal control over the federal award, and the internal control should align with the guidance set forth in GAO's Green Book or the guidance issued by COSO. When an internal external auditors review grant federal grant programs, they examine and test the internal controls in place and verify the grantee has provided reasonable assurance that grant objectives have been met. The objectives and risks that internal controls address fall into one of three categories. Operation objectives address your organization's effectiveness and efficiency in meeting your mission, goals, and objectives. Effective operations yield the outcomes expected, and efficient operations produce those outcomes at minimal cost. Internal controls related to operations will minimize risk to your federal grants and safeguard grant resources. Reporting objectives relate to the preparation and reporting of financial and non-financial information that is necessary or required in accordance with the federal grant laws and regulations. Additionally, your senior management or federal grant staff may require information in order to make decisions or evaluate the performance of federal grant programs. Compliance objectives concern your organization's ability to identify and follow all laws, regulations, and requirements related to the federal grants awarded. The oversight body and management of your organization must ensure that these objectives and the related internal controls that federal grant activities comply with federal requirements. Now, COSO and the Green Book both identify 5 components of internal control. They go on to list 17 principles associated with the 5 components. We're going to just focus on the 5 components and not get into the 17 principles, but they are listed in the Green Book that I linked in the chat. You're not required to use verbatim the framework developed by COSO and supported by GEO through the Green Book, but the federal government considers the framework to be a best practice for internal controls. So the control environment component is the foundation of all the other components. Oversight staff, such as senior management, governing bodies that are charged with governance of the organization, are responsible for establishing expectations and making certain that the internal control system is operating ethically and with integrity. All staff should understand the big picture of the organization, the goals, objectives, and how each part of the organization is connected to the other parts. The risk assessment component involves assessing the risks involved in your organization as they relate to the operation of federal grant programs, financial reporting, and federal program compliance. These activities develop the appropriate response to risks identified. Remember, federal rules require you to demonstrate reasonable compliance, not absolute. Part of the risk assessment process is not only catching risks and weaknesses. So things happen, the system that's developed should be able to catch things as they happen and allow you to correct them. Control activities are the checks and balances that are necessary to ensure that everyone is following the rules and no one person is given too much authority or control over federal grant funds. The 3 general types of control activities are preventative, detective, and corrective. Information and communication. In order for an internal control system to be successful throughout an organization, the oversight body and management need to ensure that information is communicated effectively to all staff. Written procedures should outline how your organization identifies and distributes the information that employees and other partners need in order to perform their duties. Monitoring involves resolving any issues that result from audits, or kinds of program reviews or self-assessment reviews, and take prompt action when instances of noncompliance are identified. The most effective way to find problems is to test your system regularly. In summary, all 5 of these components must work together across your organization for your objective areas, operations, reporting, and compliance to ensure that your objectives are reached. The important part of the entire system is having written policies and procedures and making sure everyone knows the policies and procedures, knows their part, and monitoring the effectiveness. The policy procedure defines who is expected to do it and how they are expected to do it. It's important to have written policies and procedures. Staff are trained on implementation. Management routinely evaluates the policy and procedure to assess the design, operating effectiveness, and risk mitigation, and updates the policies and procedures if necessary. Segregation of duties establishes a breakdown of duties so that no one person can single-handedly conduct the entire procedure in a transaction. The separation ensures a check and balance system. Assigned responsibilities should be properly documented and reviewed periodically, especially if you have turnover or changes at your organization. Example for time and effort recording would be employee completes and signs their timesheet. The supervisor reviews and approves the timesheet. Payroll specialist enters the time in the accounting system. Program manager compares recorded hours against budget and approves. Payroll specialist initiates the check processing. I know in smaller organizations, it may be more difficult to institute segregation of duties due to the lack of personnel. If staffing levels prohibit or restrict adequate segregation of duties, then management should have a more active role in the oversight of operations to provide compensating controls. Examples of compensating controls: the manager provides a high-level review. Somebody from another department performs an external review, also at a high level. Physical controls, physical assets are susceptible to misappropriation or misuse, such as cash and fixed assets, and they should be properly secured and accessible only to authorized personnel. Example, cash receipts should be kept in a lockbox and should be deposited on a regular basis. Accounting reconciliations corroborate that recorded transactions are accurate and provide the most current information for reporting. It's important to do reconciliations on a regular periodic basis. Physical reconciliations ensure assets purchased with program funds are properly utilized and stored and maintained. Example, reconcile bank statements each month to current cash balances, investigate and explain any discrepancies. Transaction and activity reviews establishes transactions that should be reviewed and authorized prior to execution. For example, you could say purchases over a certain dollar amount, say from the executive director of the program. So to wrap up, design versus operating effectiveness, management should routinely evaluate internal controls to assess the design, operating effectiveness, and risk mitigation, especially if you have turnover. You should make sure that it's still working and there aren't tweaks or changes that you need to make it more effective. Once again, uniform guidance says that grantees must establish and maintain effective internal control over federal awards and provide reasonable assurance that federal funds are managed in a way that is compliant with federal statutes, regulations, the terms and conditions of the federal award. Common internal control findings in our work that might be relatable: grantees having a lack of written policies and procedures, are procedures not operating effectively. Common recommendations: implement written policies and procedures, train staff on policies and procedures. It is important to remember the balance between internal controls and achieving the objectives of the organization. You have to have internal controls. You don't have to have burdensome internal controls that don't help you achieve the objectives. You want to find the right balance that works for the situation that you have. Before we move on, I'll pause and see if anybody has any questions, thoughts, concerns.
Hey Josh, this is Tina. I
Mhm.
received a question recently from a grantee that I think would help this group too, and they asked, is our ignorance of the laws in 2 CFR 200 enough of a defense in an audit? And I would love to hear your answer to that.
I would say no, but it depends on the gravity of the situation too. Are we talking about like an unallowable cost situation or
Yeah, most likely an unallowable cost. And just as an example, like I didn't know I couldn't buy alcohol with federal funds. So
well
can you really make me pay it back?
this is a good opportunity to remind everyone that Grants Management Department is here to help you. If you have a question about whether you can something is allowable, allocable, reasonable, can be charged to the grant, you can use grant money for it. I would reach out to grants. It's better to ask permission in this case than forgiveness, so that you don't wind up in a situation where you possibly have to pay money back.
Yeah, and I would just add that when you accept the funds, right, you are signing that you will follow the federal regulations. So that would have been the time to educate yourself on those federal regulations. And right, should an audit come and find, let's to use the example that you spent money on alcohol, which those of you that are familiar with the regulations know is not allowable. We would have to ask for the money back, right, as a first step. We can't allow you to spend money on something that's unallowable just because you didn't know. But we would take that into consideration when writing a recommendation, a finding and a related recommendation on the internal controls piece, right? We're not going to make a recommendation that says fire someone or that says but hire smarter people, right? Well, our recommendation is going to be something like provide training to your staff on the regulations so that going forward, they are familiar, and that root cause goes away. So that's what I would add.
Looks like you have a hand up from Adam.
Yeah, Joshua, I just want to thank you. This was very helpful. And I apologize if I missed this and you stated it. For a lot of the internal controls that programs or organizations will create for a specific grant, are they housing those all in the same location? Like, are they creating almost a handbook of internal controls for an entire grant? Or are these processes kind of more decentralized in different areas when kind of capturing them or documenting them, if that makes sense?
Most of the grantees that we deal with have, I would say, centralized ways of handling, but there still are some that, you have an ad hoc process that you need to address, and you have to come up with it outside of the state processes or whatever processes that you normally use for other things because it doesn't cover the particular situation. So a mixture of both.
That helps. Thank you.
Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll move on to talking about fraud, waste, and abuse, or things that can happen when internal controls are not great. I want to talk about what they are, why they happen, and then what to look out for and what to do next. So we'll start with what they are. Fraud is defined as wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. It includes false representation of facts, making false statements, or concealment of information. And kind of a classic example would be if a grantee's employee takes the money and uses it to pay for their family vacation to Hawaii, right? Not allowed. Waste, on the other hand, is the thoughtless or careless expenditure, mismanagement, or abuse of resources to the detriment or potential detriment of the US government. So it would include incurring unnecessary costs as a result of inefficient or ineffective practices, systems, or controls. And an example here would be is if you took your grant funds and you used it to buy a warehouse full of ink for your printers in your office. And the next day, you come along and buy all new printers that don't work with the ink you have. So the ink sits unused, right? We would come in and question, why did you buy all this ink if you were going to buy all new printers? Or another example might be during COVID, you bought way more hand sanitizer than you needed, like $1 million more than you needed. And it all expired and now it's not worth anything, right? We would have questioned why you bought so much and kind of what were your processes for determining how much you needed, because they clearly failed. Um, then abuse is excessive or improper use of a thing or to use something in a manner contrary to the natural or legal rules for its use. And that can happen in both financial or non-financial settings. So the example I like to use here is you take grant funds and you use them to buy iPads for your staff, right? To use out in the field for, whatever purpose, collecting information, let's say. But we come and do an audit and we say, cool, you bought iPads, show them to us. And when we open them up, it's full of, solitaire and Candy Crush and all kinds of games and nothing related to your grant. That would be an example of abuse. So what we're going to focus on for the next little bit, though, is grant fraud. We're going to talk about why people commit fraud and how to identify when they're committing fraud, and what to do if you suspect it. Not to steal the thunder from the rest of the presentation, but it is bad to deceive the federal government about the expenditure of grant funds. If we find out that you did so, you can be debarred. We can ask that money is repaid. There can be civil lawsuits and even criminal persecutions. But pop quiz, does anyone already know what it means to be debarred? You can put that in the chat. If not, I will tell you. I have no prizes, so I can't really coerce people into responding. But debarment basically means you go on the naughty list. Yeah, exactly. There's a government-wide list that is kept of people that are ineligible to receive federal funds. And I say people, but it could be people or organizations, right? So we could say, Jim, you have done this bad thing with federal funds. You may not receive them again. Or it may be more broad than that. And we could say, Jim, it's not just you, it is all of Delaware County, Pennsylvania. County, Pennsylvania may no longer receive them. And then thank you for letting me pick on you there. That's what you get for doing a good thing by answering my question. So that's what debarment means. They can it goes along hand in hand with suspension, which can be lifted after a certain amount of time. But yeah, I describe it as the naughty list, and you don't want to be on it. So, what areas of grant administration do you think are most susceptible to fraud? If you want to put that in the chat, I won't pick on you if you do. It could be anything from travel. Okay, that's one where I've seen fraud before. Supplies, another direct cost, yes. Spending money on unauthorized things, not good. And yeah, those two kind of hit on it for me. Where we see a lot of fraud coming in is in the procurement area when you are buying things and services. So vendors may try to bribe your procurement staff with promises, offers, gifts. Right. If you waive this fee for me, I'll talk to my point of contact and get you an interview, that sort of thing. There may be collusion between vendors, which has nothing to do with your procurement staff, but it's when a couple of vendors get together and decide, hey, you win this procurement, I'll win the next one. Kind of we'll do some price fixing so that we all win. Um, and then there may be conflicts of interest, right? Nepotism, purchasing from friends or relatives. You may find someone's doing business with who they have a financial interest, investments, or perhaps they're an owner or hold an interest in. Um, Folks may be accepting gifts, so on and so forth. Or then the good old standby improperly billing or performing under the contract after it's signed. So waste and abuse are pretty apparent to us. Fraud is a bit more difficult to notice because the individual is knowingly and willfully trying to conceal it. Um, but to commit a fraud, an individual has to have three things, and we call this the fraud triangle. The first is they must be able to rationalize the fraud to themselves. Then they must be under some sort of pressure, and they must have the opportunity. So I'm gonna skip the video because we got some glitches in the pre-webinar test. Um, uh, but it's essentially going through an example of an individual that has the opportunity. So they have access to do too many things within an office, right? They can set up a vendor, they can approve something for payment, and then they can cut the check. So it makes it real easy when there's no segregation of duties for one person to commit a fraud. Rationalization, that could be anything from, man, I work so hard and I don't get paid that much. Or it could be, my boss is really a jerk. I'm going to get back at him by, taking some of this money or things like that. And then pressure. It could be pressure to keep up with the Joneses, right? Live a certain lifestyle. Or it could be you're in debt of some sort, or there's an emergency within your family, that sort of thing. Um, some fun facts or not so fun facts about fraud. The longer a fraudster has worked for an organization, the more costly their fraud is by 7 times greater amounts, which goes back to the opportunity. They know how to commit the fraud. Frauds carried out by 3 or more people caused 4 times greater losses than those done by a single person. Again, getting to opportunity. But then 84% of fraudsters displayed at least one behavioral red flag, which is what we're going to talk about on this next slide here. And again, we're going to skip the video. But the lady you see up on the screen, she's a fraud investigator, right? And she talks about one of her cases where she went in and nobody claimed to know anything about fraud. But then once they had proved fraud had happened, she started talking to the folks, and they started to say, well, yeah, I guess she did always have a really nice handbag. And I guess she did drive a really nice car. And yeah, they did go on really nice vacations. And she just told us she had this like side gig of a candle business. And we thought that was how she got the money. But then in retrospect, that wasn't really adding up for them. And her point being, there are red flags. You just need to train yourself to look for them. So some of those things you should, be aware of are a sudden inconsistent office behavior. So if someone used to be, happy, outgoing, cheerful, and is suddenly avoidant or easily irritated, it could be nothing, right? It could be something going on at home, but it could be cause for alarm, especially if it's paired with some of these other red flags. That could include a reluctance to take vacations for fear that someone will uncover their schemes while they're away. It could be working long hours for the same reason. Your colleague may have financial difficulties that puts them under stress, such as incurring large medical bills, um, or they may talk about having a lavish lifestyle, such as frequent trips to the local casino or, very expensive possessions that they own. You also may notice that the employee volunteers on very specific tasks, especially when it's outside of their job, normal job responsibilities, because they want to, again, increase their opportunity to do more. Or you may notice that they have an unusually close relationship with a vendor that could indicate something like kickbacks or favoritism. Two more not so fun facts. Women who commit fraud are more likely to do so for family needs than to fund high living. And then the typical fraud goes on for 12 months before it's detected. So, if you suspect fraud, right? Oh, actually, I skipped a slide here. There we go. So, what can you do? There's a couple things. We've talked about what fraud, waste, and abuse are, why people commit fraud, and what red flags may tip you off that a fraud is in process. So, three things you can do. First one being maintaining good internal controls to help prevent fraud, waste, and abuse from occurring. Again, having good segregation of duties will really go a long way towards reducing someone's opportunity to commit fraud. It'll also help you to identify questionable things, right? If you're in the habit of reviewing every invoice that comes through, you're going to start to notice when something seems off. That leads to the second bullet point, which is have professional skepticism. What we mean by this is be alert to red flags. For example, if part of your job is to review invoices and you see one come through with a funny vendor name, let's say it's Smith Family Enterprises, and the address for the vendor is 1401 South Main Street, apartment, 2, but it's for pencils, right? You're going to start to piece together, hey, does it really make sense that someone's selling pencils out of their apartment on, Main Street? And you might ask a few questions. Again, just to give you a few examples of things to look for, the whiteboard there on the right has some of the most common examples of fraud, waste, and abuse that you may come across. But lastly, if you do suspect fraud, waste, and abuse, you should report it to my office if it relates to federal funds. So it's better to say something than not, especially if it turns out to be nothing, even if it turns out to be nothing. Because if we investigate and we found out you know about it and didn't say anything, we're going to have a lot more questions for you. So, how do you make that report? Well, there's several ways, and the method you choose depends on what you are most comfortable with. We are happy with any of these. You can email our office's joint account, which is eacoig@eac.gov. And you can email us from a work account or from a personal account. Doesn't matter. We also don't care if you want to set up, a burner Gmail account and send it from that because you want to remain anonymous. That's cool. You can also leave us a voicemail. You can use our online form, or you can contact Josh or myself directly, and we'll give you our email addresses here at the end. According to a 2024 report from the Association of Fraud Examiners, 43% of frauds were detected by a tip. More than half of those tips came from employees. And lucky for you, folks that have attended a fraud awareness briefing are twice as likely to have a tip that, convicts someone or catches someone than someone that didn't attend one of these trainings. So, if you decide that you have something to report on us, there are a few things we ask. One, we ask that your report is based on a reasonable belief that the information is accurate. We don't want office gossip. We don't want you calling us every time someone gets a new handbag to say, Judith has a new handbag. I think she's doing fraud, right? We need a little bit more to go on than that. We want specific facts about the wrongdoing. So the who, what, where, and when, and then anything else that's going to help us out. So, a good complaint might read, on July 13th, my supervisor Jane called me and asked me to approve an invoice for payment from Smith Family Enterprises for $1,000. I didn't think this was proper because the invoice said it was for, general supplies, and I didn't have personal knowledge of the services performed. The fact that her name appears in the vendor name was also strange, right? So who, what, where, when, and if you know the why, that'd be great too. Now, we know that some people get nervous about giving us their name and contact information. And if you use our online form, you do have the option to submit anonymously, as you do with email or voicemail. However, we ask that if you do that, you provide us very detailed facts about the situation so that we can take action, since we wouldn't be able to come back to you to get more information. Likewise, we want you to know that we strive to maintain confidentiality with any complaint that we receive. We know that many of our grantees are small and it's a really small industry, and we do our best to protect those involved. There are times when we may have to reveal your identity, such as during criminal proceedings or something like that. But up until that point, we do our best. Now, once we get a complaint, there's a lot of questions on what happens next. And I've listed some of the major ones here. The first is we could conduct an audit. And this is going to make sense if when we hear the details of the complaint, it sounds more like waste or abuse and less like fraud. So, for example, if we get a report, so and so hasn't submitted their grant report for 2 years. We think there's something funny going on, not sure what it is. We might come out and start with an audit to kind of wrap our hands around what's happening. We can also refer the matter to investigations. So if we get a complaint that so-and-so used grant funds to buy a new car, right? That's probably going right to investigations. Now, again, my office is small. We've got 4 people and we don't have investigators on staff. So we have a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Interior. We call them up and work closely with them to investigate the matter. It works pretty well. We can also refer matters to EAC officials. So if it's something minor or a variety of reasons, we could refer things back to the commissioners, the general counsel, even the grants team to deal with instead. We can refer matters to another entity. We often, through our hotline, get concerned yet misdirected members of the public that don't necessarily understand what it is my office has jurisdiction over. And they may raise an issue that's actually centered, with the state or local election office. And we refer those back to the appropriate entities, since we would not be able to look into them. Things like someone changed my voter registration information, or a poll worker was mean to me, that sort of thing. And then lastly, we could decline to take action. That happens if we don't have enough information, if it's a duplicate of something we've already looked into, or something similar. Now, we're not necessarily going to tell you which option we pick. We don't give you status updates, but I assure you that we do take every complaint that we get in seriously. Each one is looked at by a human, and we do take action that we deem appropriate. So that again is our contact info, and I'm going to put my email here in the chat. So you've got that as well. And Josh, if you could do the same. But that is all of my prepared presentation. I'm happy to take any questions or just talk about fraud generally. Sometimes people have really good fraud stories, and I love hearing them. So if you've got a good fraud story, from somewhere you worked in the past, obviously not your current organization, we'd love to hear those too.
Hey, Sarah, while folks are thinking about their questions, could you talk a little bit about what you would look for? This is more related to internal controls, but when an organization receives multiple streams of funding, either federal or state, what do you look for regarding like knowing that they're appropriately separating those funds and tracking the expenses the right way?
Yeah, yeah. So under uniform guidance, I think the first thing I would look at is all the funding streams need to be treated the same, right? And accounted for the same. So that's one of the first things I think we would look for. I know in one grantee we looked at gosh, I guess it was last year now. They did all of their traditional funding, right, through the normal channels, and a nice accounting system. But the grant funds they tracked on an Excel spreadsheet, right? And that Excel spreadsheet had no controls. So that was a red flag, right? Like, okay, you're taking good care of your normal funding, but with your grant funding, you're kind of loosey-goosey about it. So that's definitely something that comes up in audits from time to time. Um, and I think, yeah, I think the biggest advice I would give is just treat all your funds with appropriate internal controls, and make sure that you have a good mechanism to account for which expenses are in which budget.
That was perfect. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording, but please feel free to come off mute or raise your hand or put questions into the chat.